For 8 years, the Henry mansion was less of a home and more of a meticulously curated tomb. Salvador Henry sat in his leather-bound study, the amber liquid in his crystal glass catching the dying light of a Connecticut sunset, but he saw none of it. His gaze was fixed, as it was every evening, on the oil painting above the fireplace. Catherine looked back at him with eyes that seemed to follow him across the room, bright, vibrant, and hauntingly alive. Beside her stood a younger Salvador, a man who still believed that his billions could buy a shield against tragedy. But the true weight of the house lay in what was missing: sound. Salvador was a man who moved markets with a phone call and commanded thousands with a word, yet he was utterly powerless to hear a single daddy from the boy playing silently on the marble floors. Every time Patrick reached up to touch his right ear with that small puzzled wince, a fresh wave of guilt crashed over Salvador. He had flown in specialists from Tokyo to Switzerland, men whose time cost more than a small town's annual budget, only to be met with the same clinical shrugging. "Congenital," they whispered. "Irreversible. You must accept the silence." How could he accept it when that silence was a constant reminder of the day Catherine's voice was silenced forever? He lived in a gilded cage of his own making, surrounded by 40 acres of perfection that felt like a desert. He had everything a man could dream of: private jets, global influence, and an empire of gold, yet he would have traded every cent of it just to hear his son describe the color of the sky. As he watched the new maid, Doreen, move quietly through the periphery of his vision, he didn't realize that the walls of his silent empire were about to crumble. He saw only a staff member keeping to the shadows. He didn't see the woman who was looking at his son with the one thing money could never provide: the simple, focused power of attention. The miracle wasn't coming from a laboratory in Switzerland. It was already standing in his hallway, clutching a dusting cloth and a heart full of prayers. "Welcome to Emotional Voyage. I'm so glad you're here to share this journey with me. If this content resonates with you, please hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps me create even deeper, more meaningful videos for our community. Let's navigate these emotions together. Now let's begin." The 40-acre Henry estate was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture and manicured perfection, but to Salvador Henry, it felt more like a sprawling, gilded monument to everything he had lost. From the outside, the windows sparkled in the Connecticut sunlight and the gardens were trimmed to a precision that money alone could dictate. Yet, once the heavy oak doors closed, the atmosphere shifted into a silence so thick and heavy it felt like something had died and remained unburied. This was not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary, but a suffocating weight that governed every movement within the house. Salvador moved through his empire like a ghost haunting his own life. He had spent millions on private jets, mansions, and the finest things the world had to offer, yet none of it could fill the hollow ache in his chest. Every evening, he found himself drawn to his study, anchored by the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. There was Catherine, his late wife, her smile forever frozen in oil paint, her eyes bright with a life that had been extinguished the very day their son, Patrick, was born. The doctors had called it complications, too much bleeding and too little time, and Salvador had watched the light leave her eyes while her lips moved to say something he would never hear. The guilt of that day sat on his chest like a stone. He blamed himself for not demanding better care, for not paying closer attention. Now, he was left with Patrick, an 8-year-old boy who lived in a parallel world of absolute silence. To Salvador, his son's deafness was a physical manifestation of his own failures. He had hired the most expensive specialists from Johns Hopkins to Tokyo, men who charged thousands of dollars an hour just to run scans and eventually shrugged their shoulders. "Congenital," they said. "Irreversible." He watched Patrick through the study door, the boy sitting on the marble floor arranging toy cars in a perfect, silent line. Patrick would frequently reach up to touch his right ear, a small wince crossing his face that the high-priced doctors dismissed as a habit. Salvador wanted to reach out, to speak his son's name and have him turn around, but the silence remained an impenetrable wall between them. In this palace of gold, a billionaire was drowning, waiting for a miracle he no longer believed his money could buy. The sky over Connecticut was a bruised, heavy gray on the Tuesday morning Doreen Eller arrived at the gates of the Henry estate. The air held a biting chill, the kind that seemed to settle deep in the bones, making the towering iron gates look even more like the entrance to a fortress than a home. Doreen stood there for a moment, her knuckles white as she clutched the strap of her worn bag with both hands. Her breathing was shallow, a visible mist in the cold air, as she tried to steady the frantic rhythm of her heart. This wasn't just a job interview, it was a rescue mission. Back in Newark, the reality she had left behind was far grimmer than these manicured acres. Her grandmother, the woman who had been her anchor since her parents died when she was only 11, was fading in a nursing home bed. The letter sitting on Doreen's kitchen table was etched into her mind, 3 months behind. If she didn't secure this position, her grandmother would be moved to a state facility, a place of cold corridors and forgotten names where people went to be alone in their final days. Doreen couldn't let that happen. She remembered the nights her grandmother had worked double shifts to keep her fed, the prayers whispered over her when life felt like an impossible climb. Now, it was Doreen's turn to be the strength. When the gates finally buzzed open, the walk up the long, winding driveway felt like a journey into another world. The Georgian columns of the mansion loomed ahead, their windows sparkling with a cold, distant brilliance. She didn't care about the prestige or the billionaire's name. She only saw a paycheck that represented her grandmother's dignity. At the service entrance, she was met by Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, a woman whose face was as sharp and unforgiving as the crease in her apron. Mrs. Patterson's eyes swept over Doreen, noting her cheap coat and the desperate set of her jaw. "You're Doreen," she stated, her voice like cracking ice. "You'll clean. You'll stay quiet. And above all, you will keep to yourself. Mr. Henry doesn't tolerate disruptions, especially around his son." Doreen nodded, swallowing the lump of pride in her throat. She was here to work, to be invisible and to survive. But as she stepped over the threshold and into the suffocating silence of the mansion, she felt a strange pull, a whisper in her spirit that told her she wasn't just here to earn a living, but to find a life hidden in the shadows. The heavy, sterile silence of the Henry mansion was something Doreen felt in her very marrow as she moved through the vast corridors, her microfiber cloth trailing over surfaces that were already clinical in their cleanliness. To the rest of the staff, and even to Salvador himself, the house was a temple of quiet respect for a tragedy that never ended. But to Doreen, the silence felt like a held breath, a suffocating weight on the small boy who sat on the marble staircase, his world reduced to the silent alignment of toy cars. While the other servants bypassed Patrick with a distant, fearful pity, treating him more like a fragile museum exhibit than a child, Doreen found her pace slowing whenever she neared him. She didn't see a congenital case or a billionaire's broken air. She saw a boy whose eyes were a mirror of the same loneliness she felt when she thought of her grandmother. One afternoon, as she polished the banister nearby, she caught it again, that subtle, sharp wince. Patrick reached up, his small fingers digging into the ridge of his right ear for a fleeting second before his hand dropped back to his lap, his shoulders hunching just a fraction lower. It wasn't the gesture of a child born to silence. It was the reflexive flinch of a body enduring a persistent, hidden sting. Doreen stopped her work, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered her cousin Marcus, who had been labeled slow, until someone finally looked deep enough to find the physical wall blocking his world. She knelt a few steps away, not invading his space but lowering herself to his level. For the first time, Patrick looked up. His gaze was guarded, accustomed to being looked at by doctors but never looked into by a friend. Doreen didn't speak, she knew the vibrations would be lost to him. Instead, she offered a small, warm smile, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, bright yellow piece of paper, her fingers moving with a gentle rhythm as she folded it into the shape of a bird. She set it on the step between them. Patrick's eyes widened, the pain in his expression momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of pure, childhood wonder. In that shared breath of time, the billionaire's mansion didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. Doreen realized then that she wasn't just there to clean the floors of a palace. She was there to listen to a cry that everyone else had decided was impossible to hear. In a world that often labels people by their limitations, how often do we stop to see the person behind the problem? True connection starts the moment we stop looking for what is broken and start looking at what is real. Are you ready to see how Doreen's secret bond with Patrick changes the fate of the Henry household? Click the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the moment the silence finally breaks. Let us know in the comments. Who was the first person to truly see you for who you are? In the weeks that followed, the yellow paper bird became the first of many. Under the rigid regime of Mrs. Patterson, the mansion operated on a strict policy of invisibility. But in the quiet corners of the sun-drenched library and the shadow of the grand staircase, Doreen and Patrick built a kingdom made of parchment and silent understanding. Since Patrick could not hear her voice, Doreen taught him that love had its own alphabet, one written in the crease of a page and the stroke of a colored pencil. They developed a secret ritual. Every morning, Doreen would leave a new creation hidden in plain sight, a crimson crane perched on the windowsill, a sapphire butterfly tucked behind a silver picture frame. Patrick's eyes, once dull with the heavy weight of his isolation, began to sparkle with the thrill of the hunt. He began to respond, leaving his own drawings on the back of discarded envelopes, sketches of a tall woman with a kind smile and a crown made of golden light. Salvador, watching from the periphery of his grief, began to notice a change in the atmosphere of the house. The silence was no longer a suffocating shroud. It was being punctuated by the soft crinkle of paper and the occasional, breathless vibration of Patrick's laughter, a sound so rare it felt like a holy occurrence. One afternoon, Salvador paused in the doorway of the sunroom and saw them. Doreen was sitting on the floor, her uniform ignored, showing Patrick how to fold a complex dragon. The way she leaned in, her shoulder nearly touching his son's, and the gentle maternal way she guided Patrick's small hands, sent a strange warm ache through Salvador's chest. He had paid for the best tutors in the world, yet none had managed to bridge the gap to his son's soul like this woman with her simple scraps of paper. It was a dangerous game. Mrs. Patterson's footsteps often echoed nearby, a reminder that fraternizing was a fireable offense. But when Patrick looked at Doreen and signed a clumsy, self-taught gesture for friend, the fear of losing her job vanished. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the architect of a boy's joy. In this secret world, Patrick wasn't a congenital case, and Doreen wasn't just a servant. They were two hearts speaking a language that required no sound at all, weaving a bond of affection that was beginning to pull the entire mansion out of the dark. The golden afternoon light was suddenly severed by a long, sharp shadow that fell across the nursery floor. Doreen had been sitting on the rug, her hands mid-fold on a new emerald-green paper crane for Patrick, when the air in the room seemed to turn to ice. She didn't need to look up to know that Mrs. Patterson was standing in the doorway. The head housekeeper's presence was like a draft from a tomb, cold, rigid, and smelling faintly of starch and lemon oil. "The boy is Henry, Doreen," Mrs. Patterson's voice sliced through the quiet, vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. "He is not your project, and he certainly is not your friend." Doreen stood slowly, instinctively tucking the paper bird behind her back, but the housekeeper's sharp eyes had already tracked the movement. Mrs. Patterson stepped into the room, her sensible heels clicking like a metronome on the hardwood. She stopped inches from Doreen, her face a mask of iron. "I've seen the way you look at him. I've seen the gifts you leave behind. You think you're being kind, but you're being reckless. Mr. Henry pays for the best medical minds on this planet to manage his son's condition. Do you truly think a girl from Newark with a pocket full of scrap paper knows better than the surgeons from Johns Hopkins?" "I just think he's in pain, ma'am," Doreen whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I see him touching his ear. I see the way he winces when—" "You see nothing," Mrs. Patterson hissed, leaning in close enough that Doreen could see the clinical coldness in her pupils. "What you see is a ticket to the unemployment line. Mr. Henry values order and he values the truth of his son's diagnosis. If you continue to fill that boy's head with the idea that there is a cure, or if you dare to interfere with the silence of this house again, you will be out of those gates before your next shift begins. And we both know what that means for your grandmother, don't we?" The mention of her grandmother felt like a physical blow. Doreen's throat tightened, the weight of those unpaid nursing home bills crashing back down on her. Mrs. Patterson's gaze moved to Patrick, who was watching them with wide, confused eyes, sensing the tension he couldn't hear. "He was born deaf, Doreen. It is fixed. It is final. Stop trying to fix what cannot be fixed. With one final warning look, the housekeeper turned and marched out, leaving Doreen standing in the center of the room. The paper crane in her hand was crushed, its wings bent and broken. She looked at Patrick, then at the empty doorway, realizing that her love for the boy had now become a war against the very people who were supposed to protect him. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the manicured hedges of the Henry estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the stone paths of the formal garden. Doreen had been instructed to gather the discarded garden cushions, but her eyes never strayed far from Patrick. He was sitting near a cluster of white roses, the very flowers his mother had loved, but he wasn't playing. He was unervingly still. Suddenly, Patrick's small frame convulsed. He let out a sharp, jagged gasp. Not a cry, but a sound of pure, pressurized agony that seemed to vibrate in the stagnant air. He clutched the right side of his head with both hands, his knuckles turning a ghostly white, and collapsed onto the grass. To any passerby, it might have looked like a fit, but Doreen saw the truth. She dropped her work and sprinted across the lawn, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When she reached him, Patrick was curled in a fetal position, his face flushed a deep, alarming crimson. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and he was clawing at his ear with a desperation that made Doreen's stomach flip. This wasn't a congenital condition acting up. This was an acute, physical torture. She knelt in the dirt, pulling his hands away from his face to prevent him from breaking his own skin. "Patrick, look at me," she whispered, her voice trembling even though she knew he couldn't hear. As she gently tilted his head toward the fading light, she saw it again, that dark, glistening obstruction deep within the canal. It looked more prominent now, as if the pressure from years of neglect had finally reached a breaking point. Patrick's eyes met hers, wide and glassy with a silent plea for help that no billionaire's checkbook had been able to answer. Mrs. Patterson's warning echoed in Doreen's mind like a death knell. One more interference and you're out. Think of your grandmother. If she stayed silent, if she just ran for the house to call the proper authorities, they would call the same specialists who had ignored this for 8 years. They would sedate him, study him, and let the blockage remain while Patrick's world stayed silent and painful. But if she acted, she was risking her livelihood, her grandmother's safety, and her own freedom. She looked at the boy, the child who had learned to laugh through paper birds, and the fear for her job vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective love. She couldn't let him suffer a second longer. She scooped him up into her arms, feeling the heat of his fever against her chest. The choice was made. She wouldn't be a maid today, she would be his savior, no matter the cost. The air in the grand hallway felt thin and electrified, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Doreen sat on the polished marble floor, her back against the cold winds, cradling Patrick's head in her lap. The boy's face was slick with sweat, his small body trembling against hers. She knew she had only minutes before the security cameras or a passing servant alerted Mrs. Patterson. With trembling fingers, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small, professional-grade tweezers she had sterilized with boiling water and alcohol in the servant's pantry. "Trust me, Patrick. Please, just trust me," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of hope. Though he couldn't hear the words, he saw the fierce, maternal light in her eyes. He went unervingly still, his small hands gripping her skirt as she tilted his head toward the amber glow of a wall sconce. Doreen's breath hitched. Deep within the canal, nestled against the delicate drum, was the culprit, a dense, dark, almost obsidian-like mass of hardened wax and debris that had likely been building for nearly a decade. It was a physical wall, a silent guardian that the high-priced doctors had ignored in favor of expensive genetic theories. With the precision of a surgeon and the heart of a lioness, Doreen moved the tweezers forward. Her hand, usually steady from years of hard labor, shook for a terrifying heartbeat before finding its resolve. She caught the edge of the obstruction. Patrick let out a sharp, muffled gasp, his eyes flying wide. Doreen felt the resistance, the weight of 8 years of silence, and then, with a slow, steady pull, the blockage slid free. It was a jagged, dark pearl of neglect. For a second, there was only a void. Then, The grandfather clock at the end of the hall struck the hour. Bong! Bong! Patrick flinched violently, his entire body jerking as if he'd been struck by lightning. He scrambled back, his hands flying to his ears, but his expression wasn't one of pain. It was pure, unadulterated shock. His eyes darted around the hallway, landing on the fountain in the foyer, then on the rustle of Doreen's uniform. "Patrick!" she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. The boy's gaze snapped to her lips, then moved to her eyes. He didn't just see her movements, he heard the friction of the air, the vibration of her vocal cords. A slow, trembling smile spread across his face, and for the first time in his life, he made a sound that wasn't a grunt or a cry. He let out a soft, melodic chirp of a laugh, a sound so beautiful it shattered the remaining shadows of the house. He leaned forward, pressing his ear against Doreen's chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic thrum of the heart that had loved him enough to break the silence. The roar of the front doors hitting the marble walls echoed like a gunshot through the mansion. Salvador Henry had returned early, his heart already heavy with a day of fruitless meetings, only to find his hallway transformed into a scene of chaos. He froze, his breath hitching as he saw Doreen sitting on the floor, cradling Patrick, her hands stained with a dark, terrifying substance, and a pair of sharp metal tweezers glinting in the light. Behind them, Mrs. Patterson was already screaming for the police, her voice a jagged blade in the quiet air. "What have you done?" Salvador's voice was a low, guttural growl of pure terror. He lunged forward, snatching Patrick from Doreen's arms as if she were a predator. "You touched him. I told you to stay away from him." He didn't see the light in Patrick's eyes. He saw only the blood and the tool in the hands of a woman he had almost allowed himself to trust. Within minutes, the estate's private security had Doreen pinned against the wall, her eyes pleading but her lips silent, knowing that words wouldn't reach a man blinded by fear. Patrick was rushed to the elite private wing of the city's most prestigious hospital, with Salvador trailing behind in a state of vibrating fury. He demanded the lead specialist, Dr. Eris, the man who had managed Patrick's protocol for 5 years, be brought in immediately to assess the damage. But as the scans appeared on the high-definition monitors in the sterile observation room, the air in the room shifted. Dr. Eris went pale, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. Salvador stood over him, eyes narrowed. "Tell me the damage," Salvador barked. "Tell me how badly she hurt him." "Mr. Henry," the doctor stammered, his voice thin. She didn't hurt him. She removed it." "Removed what?" "The obstruction. It's gone." "But that's impossible. Our records show." The doctor stopped abruptly, realization dawning too late. Salvador stepped into the doctor's personal space, his shadow looming large. He snatched the digital tablet from the desk, scrolling back through years of Patrick's records. Deep in the encrypted notes of the treatment protocol, he found it, a hidden file dated 3 years ago. Obstruction noted. Surgical removal recommended. Recommendation suppressed per billing cycle requirements for ongoing acoustic therapy. The world tilted. Salvador looked at the screen, then at the doctor who had taken millions of his dollars while his son lived in a silent prison of pain. It hadn't been an incurable condition. It had been a profitable one. The experts had intentionally left his son deaf to keep the billionaire's checks flowing. His fury suddenly turned from Doreen to the man in the white coat. In that moment, Salvador realized that the only person who had been honest with him was the woman he currently had in handcuffs. The silence that had defined the Henry estate for 8 years didn't just break, it dissolved into a symphony of raw, human emotion. Back at the mansion, the heavy iron gates stood open, no longer a barrier but a gateway to a life transformed. Salvador found Doreen in the small garden where Patrick had collapsed, the very place where her bravery had nearly cost her everything. She was packing her few belongings into a worn bag, her shoulders slumped with the expectation of the dismissal she had been threatened with. Salvador didn't approach her with the cold authority of a billionaire. He came with the staggered, humble steps of a man who had finally found his sight. When she turned, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and dignity, Salvador did something that would have shocked the world of high finance. He fell to his knees in the dirt at her feet. I trusted the wrong things, Doreen, he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that was finally being washed away by gratitude. I trusted degrees, and prestige, and the cost of the care. I spent a fortune trying to buy a miracle, and I was too blind to see that the miracle was standing right in front of me, holding a paper bird. Doreen reached out, her hands, the same hands that had performed a surgical wonder with a pair of household tweezers, gently lifting him up. You were just a father trying to protect his son, Mr. Henry. You don't need to apologize for that. I do, Salvador insisted, standing but refusing to let go of her hands. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the depth of her courage and the warmth that had been missing from his life for a decade. You gave Patrick his voice. You gave me back my son. And in the process, I think you saved me, too. The air between them was no longer heavy. It was light, filled with a budding affection that went far beyond the roles of master and servant. In the distance, they heard a sound that made them both stop. Patrick was in the sunroom, his voice, rough, unpracticed, and beautiful, calling out to them. Salvador looked into Doreen's eyes and saw not just a savior for his son, but a future for himself. He took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers, and together they walked toward the house. The bills for Doreen's grandmother were already paid in full, the corrupt doctors were facing justice, and for the first time in 8 years, the Henry mansion was finally, beautifully, filled with the sound of love. Sometimes the greatest wealth we can possess is the ability to recognize the value in those the world overlooks. Have you ever found a treasure in a place you never expected to look?
Thank you for joining us on this journey of faith, healing, and love. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone who needs to hear that miracles are possible. From all of us here, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.